This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Get the best deal on it at nordvpn.com/uncivilized.
Is Zack Snyder an auteur?
What defines a Snyder Cut? There wouldn't even be a Snyder Cut if there wasn't something that made his work distinctively his. Usually that's thought to be his visuals.
People would think I was known for slow motion.
And yeah, no matter how many times people try to copy that Zack Snyder style, they never quite seem to get it right. Probably because they think it's just style. But some of his shots, like this one from Batman v Superman, contain enough substance to fill an entire video. And that video would be about the international scope of Superman's mission, the spiritual deadness of humanity, and the way that they treat Kal-El like the Messiah. Stuff like this is why critics who liked the movie called it a thrillingly intelligent, high-quality superhero movie for adults, filled with discussions of philosophy and theology. But actually, most of them didn't like the movie. They called it things like dopey, witless, and hollow. See, Snyder's different from someone like Michael Bay. Everyone pretty much agrees on what Michael Bay movies are, they just disagree about whether they like it or not. But with Snyder, it's like they're watching two different movies. As you've probably guessed, there's a reason why that is, but it doesn't have much to do with Snyder's style. See, Snyder Cuts aren't so much defined by the way Snyder frames his images, as they are by the way he frames his stories. There's two reasons you might want to actually watch through this sponsored section of the video. One, NordVPN is a well-designed and useful product, and two, there's not really a way to do it without explaining one of my behind-the-scenes writing hacks. You may already know this, but a VPN is a piece of technology that routes your internet usage through the VPN's private server. This effectively masks your activity from whatever entity is providing your actual internet connection. It's a simple idea with a lot of implications. For example, it's pretty well known that they let you determine where your internet appears to be coming from, which can give you access to services only available in certain parts of the world. Speaking for myself, I get stranded on public Wi-Fi a lot, and using NordVPN lets me keep working without worrying about the Wi-Fi provider looking in on whatever it is I happen to be doing that day. The interface is super intuitive, it's really easy to use, and it has some other features if you dig a little deeper, like a double VPN setting. By the way, if it sounds weird to hear me say I in a segment like this, one of the writing tricks I use on this channel is I strike all first-person singular pronouns from my scripts, which keeps me from falling into a lot of the common traps of making a video essay. In that way, it's a little bit like NordVPN, which can help you avoid common traps of using the internet. If you check it out at nordvpn.com/uncivilized, you'll get the best deal currently available for this service. Using that link gets you 4 extra months free with any 2-year package. Now, we were talking about Zack Snyder and what defines a Snyder Cut. But to do that, we need to turn back the clock a little bit on Zack Snyder's career, because understanding his project requires a deeper dive than just one movie. If we just go based on trailers, 300 was the movie that earned Zack Snyder the title, a visionary director. But even though it was an instantly iconic filmmaking landmark,
this is Sparta!
Critics couldn't seem to decide whether it was actually good or not.
Despite your several insults, the Lord of Hosts is prepared to forgive all.
The movie isn't perfect, for sure. It suffers a bit from this on-again, off-again pacing issue, mostly felt in the political subplot that was added because Snyder and company felt the book was a little, well,
Spartan!
Some people also didn't like that the movie, how best to say this, exaggerated the history of the Battle of Thermopylae. It wasn't all made up.
Because only Spartan women give birth to real men.
Lay down your weapons! Come and get them! Our arrows will blot out the sun.
Then we will fight in the shade.
But a lot of it kinda was, which led some critics to dwell on how its preposterous visuals contain nothing remotely like reality. Well, fair enough. On the other hand, it's really cool. Some of the criticism was more serious though, like the people who called it a porno military curiosity and army recruiting film, which celebrates a fascist ideal that it's very possible the Führer might have loved. As everyone knows, the biggest problem with Hitler was his taste in movies.
Remnants of a senseless tradition.
But if you sort of squint, the description isn't that far off. 300 doesn't just play fast and loose with the facts of history, it plays fast and loose with them in a way that glorifies the Spartan way of life.
Come back with your shield, or on it.
And the Spartan approach to battle.
Give them nothing, but take from them everything!
The hero of the movie was explicitly selected as an infant for his physical perfection.
If he'd been small or puny, or sickly or misshapen, he would have been discarded.
It does start to look like war propaganda. The Spartans take great joy, not just in displays of bravery or the brotherhood of the militia, but in the sheer carnage of the battlefield.
They look thirsty! Well, let's give them something to drink!
And again, it's very cool. Rotten Tomatoes sort of summarizes all the critical responses by saying the movie is visually exciting, but simple-minded. At the very least, this movie is politically naive.
Glorious.
But that raises a question. Is it fair to assume that the guy who put together this shot is just naive to what his movies are saying? Because here's something that most of these reviews aren't taking into account. This whole story is told to us by a narrator, Dilios.
Our King Leonidas!
And Dilios is half blind. You could say his perspective is literally one-sided.
You'll have a grand tale to tell. Tale of victory.
And if you think a stylist like Snyder doesn't understand the implications of that visual, he actually draws more attention to it than the book does. There are parts in the book where it's not even clear that Dilios is narrating the story, and we don't see him with a missing eye until the very end. Snyder makes it explicit that 1, this story is told entirely by Dilios, and 2, his perspective is compromised from his first scene.
Ready to devour tiny Greece, the world's one hope for reason and justice.
This might go some way to explaining other decisions, like the portrayal of the Immortals. Where the book is content to leave them mysterious and faceless, the movie goes out of its way to show them as subhuman monsters.
Eyes as dark as night, teeth filed to fangs. The Immortals.
And that's not the only thing the movie version finds a way to slightly exaggerate. The opening shot of the pile of infant skulls was not in the graphic novel at all. Adding it not only draws attention to the cost of Leonidas' selection, but it surrounds the entire story with images of death. Still, it makes sense that some people miss this. This is not how most movies handle an unreliable narrator. 300 isn't a tragedy or a satire, and there's no climactic sequence where the narrative falls apart. It's actually a little weird for a movie to signal such an obvious unreliable narrator without ever actually contradicting his story. There's a tension created here that Snyder never bothers to resolve. But should he want to? Because, on the other hand, the Battle of Thermopylae really did happen. What Leonidas and the Spartans did has become the stuff of legend. Maybe 300 is just being more honest than most movies, that it's not giving you the full story. Or yeah, maybe it's a spoof that turns the whole thing into a macho war hype video. The point is, Snyder isn't making that decision for you.
An age of freedom!
300 kind of says, yeah, why not, to all of these potential interpretations. And it was also just the beginning of the way Snyder would manipulate narrative over the course of his career. The success of 300 led him to adapt Watchmen. And even though it, too, is a story that deals with contradictory narratives and unreliable narrators, that also got a pretty mixed reception from the critics. The Snyder cut that got really complex in this area is the one he designed from the ground up. Sucker Punch is sort of like a Funhouse mirror version of 300. Instead of a hyper-faithful adaptation, it's a fully original work. And instead of the movie focusing on masculine victory, it gives us a story of female exploitation. And it continued the Snyder tradition of getting mixed— Whoa! Yikes. Okay, so critics went in hard this time. They accused Sucker Punch of being creatively bankrupt and appallingly bad, a tawdry and repellent action fantasy, even the worst film of the year. Well, at least no one brought up Hitler, right? But its defenders are out there too, with a few calling it things like one of the most misunderstood films of the decade. Again, we seem to have two different movies. But Sucker Punch invites this disagreement in a much more explicit way than 300 ever did. This time, the opening shot makes it even more obvious that we shouldn't trust anything we see. The story is split into somewhere between 3 and 5 different layers of narrative, dealing with the imprisonment of our main character, Baby Doll, alternately portrayed in an abusive psych ward, a seedy brothel, and a series of gonzo video game-inspired action scenes. Depending on who you ask and how complicated you want to think the movie is, Baby Doll herself might be yet another layer of metaphorical projection.
This was never my story. It's yours.
So yeah, it's a lot. It's probably too much. It's easy to lose an emotional connection to a story that requires this much cerebral interpretation to filter it through, especially when it comes to those combat sequences, which, cool though they may be, are so detached from reality that they wind up undercutting the tension built up in the rest of the movie. Everything happening in Sucker Punch is conceptually interesting, and if you're into this kind of stuff, well, you're into it. But there's a reason that even a lot of the people who appreciate what Snyder was going for wound up viewing the movie as something like an ambitious misfire. But, as with 300, there's a more serious accusation that the movie has to deal with, which is that Sucker Punch itself is exploiting the female characters and the actresses who play them, that directing the movie effectively makes Snyder a pimp. After all, the first major shift in framing from the asylum to the brothel doesn't really feel very empowering, and the victories they do find there turn out to be fleeting at best.
You gave us quite a scare, you know.
And yeah, things go better for them in the action scenes, but it's hard to deny that these revisionist fantasies turn out to be just that. Fantasies. Still, it seems like a stretch to put Snyder on the side of the sadistic wardens, pimps, and joeys of the movie.
You know, people don't acknowledge it, but you know, it's a protest movie in a lot of ways. I always saw it as an indictment. You know, like I was asked at the time, like, why did you dress the girls like that? And I always go, I didn't dress them like that, you did.
It's pretty clear that the movie is about how the girls use the exploitation in their environment as a path to their own empowerment.
I got them to watch me dance.
While we run around and pick their pockets?
Yeah, that's right.
It's why the dances are replaced with the action scenes. The brothel customers still see them as just pure titillation, but Baby Doll sees an avenue to start taking back her freedom. Snyder seems to be saying the girls' ability to take control of their own narrative is the ultimate empowerment.
It's every one of us who holds the power over the worlds we create.
But not everyone's buying this, because while 300 may have left its narrative tension in the background, the ending of Sucker Punch puts it front and center. The empowerment narrative is uncomfortable, because all of Baby Doll's interpretive fantasies aren't enough to change her reality. It's not just that Sucker Punch has multiple narrative layers, it's that all those narrative layers are in conflict with each other. There's a tension here that Snyder never fully resolves, but it seems like that's the idea. What people see when they look at a Snyder movie is a big part of what a Snyder movie is all about. And whether Sucker Punch as a whole is a story of exploitation or empowerment largely depends on which of its narratives is truest. And that's a decision that Snyder deliberately leaves in your hands.
Who chains us? And who holds the key that can set us free? It's you.
This idea of the importance of choice between narratives is at the center of Snyder's take on our most famous modern myth.
Goodbye, my son. Our hopes and dreams travel with you.
Man of Steel does not open with an unreliable narrator telling us the story. Instead, it puts the idea of conflicting narratives right into the heart of Superman's story.
Why did you send me here?
In this version of Superman, all the inhabitants of Krypton are genetically engineered for one particular sort of life.
Every child was designed to fulfill a predetermined role in our society.
Kal-El, on the other hand, has no genetic manipulation.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious. The element of choice.
The story of Superman is one Kal-El will have to write himself, and the movie makes that, intentionally, confusing. A lot of superhero movies have a father figure there to give the hero some direction. Man of Steel gives Superman two, who have two very different ideas of who he's supposed to be.
You will give the people of Earth an ideal to strive towards.
Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
Snyder's whole presentation of Superman seems confusing too, even with regard to the filmmaking itself. Because on the one hand, it presents him as a Christ-like savior, Not a crazy idea, we've seen Superman do this before. But the obvious Jesus images are matched by equally obvious images of 9/11 and mass graves. The consequences of Superman's arrival on Earth are biblical, appropriate since he's often used as an allegory for the divine. But Snyder knows that encountering God can feel like both salvation and destruction. When Snyder does this, he's not trying to be coherent.
Trying to say, like, what is Superman for now, for us, for our generation?
Superman has traditionally stood for truth, justice, and the American way. But this Superman emerged at a time where his audience probably couldn't even agree on what those things mean. What is a symbol of hope in a divided world? But even as Snyder challenges these preconceptions about Superman, he's not trying to fully deconstruct him.
Watchmen, yes, it's a complete deconstruction. Like, you took the entire thing apart, the car. In Man of Steel, the thing was put the car back together now. That concept kind of goes across the entirety of my DC run. We were gonna take the entire thing apart in BVS and then put the thing back together and then take it apart again and then put it back together again.
Superheroes supposedly tell us who we are. So what happens when they don't know who they are? In BVS, both Batman and Superman are in a narrative where the other is the villain.
That's how it starts. The feeling of powerlessness turns good men cruel.
This confusion drives every part of the movie. It's intensified by the media, and it's exploited by Lex Luthor. The big fight is what happens when Batman and Superman try to force a resolution without coming to an understanding.
The world only makes sense if you force it to.
The most famous moment of the movie has to do with their two stories becoming one.
Save Martha!
And yeah, okay, this is one of those times where Snyder gets a little clumsy.
Why did you say that name?
Look, the guy isn't perfect, but he's not really claiming to be. He knows his approach can be polarizing.
And the internet can be cruel, which it was.
But appropriately enough, Snyder's okay with there being conflicting narratives about his own work.
I like the cyclical nature of the internet. It's cool. It's poetic, truly.
Contradiction is what defines a Snyder cut. Like in Justice League, where his heroes have to unify to fight a unity. And sure, he does this in ways that make some people uncomfortable, but isn't the world a little contradictory? Especially when it comes to things like the thin barrier between inspiration and propaganda, or between exploitation and empowerment, or the fear that the work of a savior might result in someone's world coming apart. Snyder seems less interested in telling you what to think than in giving you things to think about. It's worth mentioning, too, that a lot of artists are nothing like this. They tell stories so that you know what they think. They're not interested in exploring a complex idea, or even in admitting that many ideas are complex. If you're a fan of Snyder's approach, this very open-endedness is what makes his movies so interesting to watch. And if you're not a fan of it, well, that's fine. He certainly wouldn't hold it against you.
Is Zack Snyder an auteur? I think I'm going to leave that up to the audience to decide.
You didn't think we'd forget about the Owls of Ga'Hoole, right? It's actually the movie that inspired this entire video. Since a story about two brothers who wind up on opposing sides of a conflict because one of them believes in the old legends of a mythical warrior sect called the Guardians, and the other has been, funnily enough, listening to Nazi propaganda, well, you get the idea. Make sure to subscribe or find other ways to keep in touch, because next time, we'll be tackling this. Or maybe this. We'll see which one comes first.